Many weeks ago, long before the first date was even scheduled, Aunty Maryam had already started preparing for the inevitable battle over her daughter's heart. It began the afternoon Zara walked into the living room glowing for no reason. "Mama," she said, her voice betraying a happiness that Maryam immediately found suspicious, "I finally said yes to a date." Maryam did not panic. She had raised Zara with the strength of a lioness, but she also knew a fundamental truth. A man's smile is often just a curtain for his secrets. "What is his name?" Maryam asked, her voice as neutral as a judge's. "Toby," Zara replied. "Toby Bankole." Maryam's eyes narrowed. "And what does this Toby do for a living?" Zara hesitated, then smiled. "He's a creative brand strategist." Maryam felt her spirit tighten. Creative, strategist. In her world, these were just modern words for professional deceiver. An invisible job, she muttered under her breath. When Toby finally came to pick Zara up, he arrived with a simple bouquet of flowers and a smile that was too polite, too smooth, and far too practiced. Maryam watched him from the balcony like a hawk surveying a field. He didn't fidget, he didn't stutter. He simply stood there with a level of confidence that Maryam found offensive. After they left for the resort, Maryam sat in her room and replayed the encounter in her mind. He was too organized. Organized men know exactly where to bury their mistakes. She reached into her wardrobe and pulled out her observation uniform, a teal hijab that blended into the shadows, and sunglasses that hid her intent. "Zara does not know what she does not know," Maryam whispered to the empty room. She wasn't following them, she was verifying, because in a world where modern dating was a swimming pool of temptation, Maryam was determined to be the only one with the lifeguard's whistle.
If you're watching this channel, please like and subscribe for more. Also, tell me in the comment section where you are watching my folktale story from. I want to know how far it has traveled. Let's get back to the story.
The living room was quiet, filled only with the rhythmic tick of the wall clock, until the front door creaked open. Zara walked in, and immediately the air in the room seemed to shift. She wasn't just home, she was radiating. Her steps had a lightness to them, a bounce that hadn't been there that morning, and her face held a soft, persistent smile that she tried and failed to tuck away the moment she saw her mother sitting by the window. "Mama," she said, her voice sounding like a song that had been played on repeat all afternoon, "I'm back." Aunty Maryam did not return the smile. She sat as still as a statue, her eyes performing a slow, clinical scan of her daughter from her head down to her shoes. She saw the way Zara's eyes sparkled, the way she played with the edge of her scarf, and the way she seemed to be looking at a world that was far more beautiful than the one Maryam occupied. In her experience, a girl only glowed like this for two reasons. She had either found a miracle or a mistake. "You are glowing for no reason," Maryam observed, her voice flat and heavy with caution. "Sit down." Zara sat, still caught in the afterglow of her afternoon. "I met someone, Mama. His name is Toby Bankole. We've been talking, and I finally said yes to a date." The word date hit the room like a physical weight. Maryam felt the familiar stretch of alarm bells in her chest, the same ones that had guarded her through decades of seeing calm men turn into storms. She didn't panic. She simply began the mental interrogation she believed every mother owed her child. "Toby," Maryam repeated, tasting the name like it was suspicious fruit. "What does he do? Where does he work?" Zara's smile faltered slightly, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "He's a creative brand strategist, Mama. He works with big companies to help them tell their stories." Maryam's eyes narrowed until they were thin slits of judgment. "Creative, strategist," she whispered, "another invisible job." To Maryam, a man with an invisible job was a man with invisible secrets. If you couldn't see the software he built or the bricks he laid, how could you see his character? He is very polite, Mama, very organized, Zara added, trying to bridge the growing gap of silence. But organized was the loudest red flag of all. In Maryam's mind, organized men were simply men who knew exactly how to hide things, men who practiced their smiles in the mirror until they looked too innocent to be questioned. "I want to see him," Maryam said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "A quiet date is where secrets breathe, and I will not have my daughter walking into a swimming pool of temptation without a lifeguard." Zara laughed, a nervous, fluttering sound. "Mama, it's just a date." "It is never just a date," Maryam replied, looking at the hope in her daughter's face and seeing only a target for disappointment. "It is destiny, and remember, Zara, I am watching." 2 weeks later, the day of the interview arrived. Toby came to visit carrying a fruit basket that looked as though each apple and grape had been hand-selected for symmetry. He wore a simple, crisp native attire and offered a smile that Maryam immediately catalogued as too innocent. As he sat in the living room, Maryam watched him from head to toe with the unblinking focus of airport security. She was looking for a crack in the polish, a stutter in his confidence, or a flicker of the invisible nature of his creative brand job. "Which church do you attend?" Maryam began, her voice a calm but sharp probe. Toby folded his hands respectfully, his posture perfectly composed. "I believe in God deeply, Ma." Maryam leaned back slowly, her eyes narrowing as she pushed for a concrete answer. "That is good, but where do you attend?" Toby didn't flinch. "I am spiritual," he said softly. The room became quiet, the kind of silence where Maryam's internal alarm bells began to stretch and scream. "Spiritual? How?" she pressed. Toby smiled that inner Wi-Fi look again, the kind of look that suggested he was connected to a frequency Maryam couldn't jam. "I pray, I meditate, and I try to live intentionally." Intentionally, meditate. To Maryam, these were not words of faith, they were words of evasion. She smelled a small, lingering scent of trouble. To her, a man who meditated was a man who had enough internal space to hide 1,000 secrets. After he left, Maryam didn't wait for the door to click shut before calling her sister. "This boy is too organized," she whispered into the phone. When her sister suggested organization was a virtue, Maryam scoffed. "No. Organized men know exactly how to hide things." She told her sister about his spiritual answer, which was met with a gasp of shared confusion. That night, Maryam lay awake replaying the conversation. Toby had not stuttered, he had not overtalked or even tried to defend himself against her coldness. He had simply remained calm, a trait she found rare and deeply suspicious. If there was no obvious problem to fight, it meant the problem was buried where she couldn't see it. She decided then that if Toby was a strategist, she would have to be a general. She would not be outmaneuvered by a polite smile and a fruit basket. The tension in the house shifted from a simmer to a rolling boil the moment Zara announced the location of the date. Zara had said, "A luxury resort by the waterfront," her voice filled with an innocent excitement that Maryam found deeply troubling. To Zara, it was a beautiful backdrop for a new beginning, but to Maryam, a resort was nothing more than a swimming pool of temptation, where the boundaries of decent behavior were diluted by the sound of splashing water and expensive music. In her mind, luxury was often a shroud for lack of character, and a quiet resort was exactly where secrets were given the room to breathe. "Why a resort?" Maryam asked, her voice tight with the weight of 1,000 unspoken warnings. "Is the city not big enough for a simple dinner? Why must it be a place where people wear half-clothes and hide behind sunglasses?" Zara sighed, a sound of mounting frustration. "Mama, it's just a nice place with a view. Toby wanted it to be special." But special was a word Maryam translated as dangerous. She spent the evening staring at her phone, scrolling through the resort's website with the intensity of a forensic investigator. She saw the pictures of white sheets, dim lighting, and balconies that overlooked the river. Dim lights mean secrecy, she muttered to herself, echoing a long-held philosophy that anything good could happen in the bright, honest light of day. She zoomed in on the poolside area, noting the large potted plants and the shaded corners. It was a layout designed for nonsense, a strategic map of places where a young girl's destiny could be derailed by a smoot talker with an invisible job. Her heart refused to relax. She felt a spiritual tightening in her chest, a conviction that this wasn't just a date, but a test of her maternal vigilance. She couldn't stop thinking about the reassuring language Toby had used during the interview. It felt like psychological bonding designed to lower Zara's guard. If the environment was designed to be relaxed, then Maryam had to be the one to remain rigid. "I am not following," she whispered to the empty room as she clicked the Book Now button on the resort's website, her fingers hovering only briefly before the finality of the click. She chose a standard room, a place from which she could observe without being part of the temptation. As the confirmation email flashed on her screen, Maryam felt a grim sense of satisfaction. If the resort was a place where secrets breathed, she would be there to hold her breath and listen. That night, while the rest of the house settled into the quiet rhythm of sleep, Aunty Maryam sat on the edge of her bed, her suitcase open like an altar of preparation. Her heart refused to settle into the peace Zara had promised. Instead, it beat with the heavy, persistent thud of a woman on a rescue mission. She wasn't just packing clothes, she was selecting a tactical wardrobe for a spiritual retreat that Zara knew nothing about. She reached into the back of her closet and pulled out the teal hijab. It was a deep, silent color, chosen specifically because it was conservative enough to be invisible in a crowd, but distinct enough to signify authority. She folded it with the precision of a soldier, smoothing out every wrinkle. To the world, it was a symbol of her faith, but tomorrow it would be her camouflage. Beside it, she placed a pair of oversized black sunglasses, the kind that turned the world dim and kept her own eyes hidden from the reassuring gaze of men like Toby. Her fingers moved to her nightstand, where a small glass vial of anointing oil sat. She didn't hesitate as she tucked it into the side pocket of her bag. This was her emergency safeguard, for a location where she feared secrecy meant room for nonsense. If the resort was a place where secrets breathe, she would be armed with the only substance she trusted to break them. She added a prayer shawl and 2 simple wrappers, items that spoke of a woman going for a retreat, not a stakeout. As she zipped the bag, she felt a grim sense of destiny. "Follow is a strong word," she whispered to the shadows, echoing a thought she had held on to since she first saw Toby's too innocent smile. She preferred the word observe. She was a mother who had raised her daughter well, but she also knew that quiet places were dangerous. She picked up her phone and sent a final vague message to her sister. "I am traveling small for a strategic retreat. The eyes that see clearly must stay open." She didn't mention the resort or the room she had booked 3 doors away from the swimming pool of temptation. She simply locked her door, checked her observation uniform one last time, and prepared for the morning. Zara believed she was going to a place of rest, but Maryam knew she was heading toward a battlefield where her only weapons were a teal veil and a mother's unyielding suspicion. The sun was high and unforgiving when Aunty Maryam arrived at the waterfront resort, but she felt as cool as a shadow inside her teal hijab. She walked through the marble lobby with her chin held at a spiritual angle, her oversized sunglasses acting as a one-way mirror between her suspicion and the world. When she reached the reception desk, she didn't use the name Maryam. She checked in under a distant family surname, her voice a practiced whisper. If Toby was a strategist, she was a ghost. 204, the receptionist said, handing over the keycard with a polite smile. Maryam accepted it without a word, her mind already calculating the geometry of the building. Zara had mentioned they were in room 307, 3 doors away, a perfect monitoring distance. The moment the bellboy left her room, Maryam did not unpack her wrappers or her prayer shawl. Instead, she moved straight to the desk by the window and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. On the first page, she wrote in sharp, decisive script, "Observation log, day 1, Operation Verification." She checked her watch, 2:14 p.m. She moved to the heavy curtains and parted them by a mere inch, peering out at the sprawling poolside area below. The resort was exactly as she had feared, too peaceful, too beautiful, and filled with dim lights even in the afternoon sun. She saw the white sun loungers arranged like traps around the turquoise water. And then she saw them. Zara and Toby were walking toward the pool. Zara looked relaxed, wearing a light denim dress and white sunglasses, her laughter drifting up to the balcony like a taunt. Toby walked beside her, carrying a picnic basket with that same too innocent stride Maryam had noted weeks ago. Maryam's pen flew across the paper. Entry 1. Subject T exhibits high levels of reassuring body language. Subject Z appears vulnerable to psychological bonding. They have chosen a spot near the palm trees, low visibility area. She watched them as they settled on the loungers, Toby pouring a drink for Zara with a flourish that Maryam marked down as over-attentive theater. To anyone else, it was a beautiful date, but to Maryam, it was a scene that required a witness. She reached for her binoculars, her heart beating with the grim satisfaction of a woman who knew that quiet places are where secrets breathe. She wasn't here to enjoy the view. She was here to ensure the view didn't steal her daughter's future. As she adjusted the focus on her lenses, she whispered a small prayer, not for peace, but for the exposure she felt was surely coming. The log was open, the teal veil was set, and the lifeguard was finally on duty. The following afternoon, the sun beat down on the resort's poolside with a brilliance that Aunty Maryam found absolutely offensive. It was too bright for a woman whose work thrived in the shadows. She had exchanged her indoor surveillance for a more daring maneuver, descending to the poolside in her full teal hijab and oversized sunglasses. To the casual observer, she was just another guest seeking shade. To herself, she was a tactical operative closing in on the target. She spotted them near the edge of the water. Zara was laughing at something Toby had said, her head tilted back in a way that signaled a complete and dangerous lack of vigilance. Maryam scanned the area for cover. The only thing between her and their lounge chairs was a cluster of decorative potted plants. She moved toward them with the calculated grace of a retired principal approaching a rowdy classroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. She crouched behind a lush, leafy shrub, her notebook open and her pen ready. But as she settled into position, a cold realization washed over her. The plant was shorter than her expectation. No matter how much she hunched her shoulders or tucked in her chin, the top of her teal hijab poked out from the foliage like a flag of surrender. "Mama?" The voice was sharp, a mixture of disbelief and sudden realization. Maryam froze. She considered staying perfectly still, hoping they would think she was a particularly elaborate garden ornament, but it was too late. Zara was standing up, her face a mask of mounting horror. Beside her, Toby had already risen, his expression not one of anger, but of that same maddeningly polite smile that Maryam had spent weeks trying to deconstruct. "Aunty Maryam?" Toby asked, his voice calm and steady, devoid of the guilt she had traveled so far to find. Maryam stood up slowly, brushing a stray leaf from her sleeve with as much dignity as a woman caught in a bush could muster. She adjusted her sunglasses, though they offered no protection from the burning embarrassment of the moment. She looked at Toby, expecting him to flinch or stutter, but he simply stood there, looking at her with a profound, quiet pity. "I was just checking the botanical variety of the resort," Maryam said, her voice wavering for the first time. "I am on a retreat." "From behind a plant, Mama?" Zara's voice was trembling now, not with fear, but with the pain of a daughter who realized she wasn't being protected, she was being hunted. The silence that followed was heavier than any wall. In that moment, the retired principal finally met the polite smile face to face, and for the first time in her life, Aunty Maryam realized that the only person whose secrets were being exposed in the bright afternoon sun was her own. The evening air at the resort was usually reserved for the clinking of glasses and the soft hum of jazz, but for Aunty Maryam, it felt like a courtroom where she was both the judge and the accused. Despite the humiliation by the poolside, her spirit remained restless. She had convinced herself that her exposure was merely a test of her resolve, a spiritual obstacle placed in her path to prevent her from seeing the final hidden truth. Driven by this desperate logic, she descended to the resort's grand dining hall for the dinner buffet. She kept her teal hijab wrapped tight and her sunglasses on, despite the dim amber lighting of the hall. She moved through the line with a trembling hand, reaching for a serving spoon of smoky jollof rice, her eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. And then she saw them. Zara and Toby were seated at a small candlelit table near the window. They weren't eating, they were talking in low, urgent tones, and Zara's face was wet with tears. Maryam's heart gave a violent lurch. This is it, she thought, a surge of adrenaline masking her shame. The mask is slipped, he has hurt her. She abandoned her plate, the jollof rice forgotten, and marched toward their table, her boots clicking loudly against the marble floor. "I knew it!" she cried out before she even reached them, her voice cracking the elegant silence of the room. "I knew the organized smile was a lie. Zara, stand up! We are leaving this place of temptation right now!" The entire restaurant went silent. Zara looked up, her eyes red and wide with a heartbreak that Maryam didn't recognize. It wasn't the heartbreak of a victim, it was the grief of a daughter who had just lost her hero. "Mama, sit down," Zara whispered, her voice dangerously thin. "I will not sit while this creative strategist manipulates you," Maryam barked, pointing a shaking finger at Toby. Toby stood up slowly. He didn't look angry, he looked exhausted. "Aunty Maryam," he said, his voice steady enough for her to flinch. "Zara isn't crying because of me. She's crying because she spent the last hour trying to explain to me why the mother she admires doesn't think she is capable of choosing a good man. She's crying because you're here, in a fake name, hiding behind plants, instead of just asking us how we feel." Maryam froze. She looked at the faces around her, the curious guests, the embarrassed waiters, and finally her daughter. Zara wasn't looking for protection. She was looking at her mother with a cold, devastating clarity. "I am not you, Mama," Zara said, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "Your past is not my present. You didn't come here to save me. You came here because you couldn't control me." Standing there, caught between the smell of the buffet and the sight of her daughter's breaking heart, Aunty Maryam felt the weight of her teal hijab for the first time. It didn't feel like armor anymore. It felt like a shroud. The taxi ride back from the resort was the quietest journey of Aunty Maryam's life. Outside the window, the world moved on in its usual chaotic brilliance, but inside the car, the air was heavy with the scent of anointing oil and the bitter taste of a failed mission. She didn't look at her observation log once. The leather-bound book sat in her lap like a heavy stone, its pages filled with the frantic scribbles of a woman who had mistaken her own shadows for her daughter's enemies. When she reached the familiar gates of her street, the neighborhood looked exactly the same, yet Maryam felt like a stranger returning from a long exile. She walked past the landlord, who greeted her with a cheerful nod. "Welcome back, Ma. How was the spiritual retreat? I hope the heavens opened for you." Maryam paused, her hand gripping the strap of her bag. She thought of the short plant and the cold, devastating clarity in Zara's eyes at the buffet. "The heavens did not open," she said softly, her voice sounding older than it had 2 days ago. "But my eyes did." Inside the silence of her living room, Maryam sat down in her favorite armchair, the same spot where she had first interrogated Toby about his invisible job. She reached into her bag and pulled out the teal hijab.
She stared at it for a long time. For years, she had worn her suspicion like a garment of holiness, believing that her lack of trust was the only thing keeping her daughter from falling. She had traveled to that resort to unmask a villain, but as she looked at her reflection in the darkened television screen, she realized she had only succeeded in unmasking herself. She was a woman who had allowed her own past wounds to become a map for her daughter's future. She had been so busy looking for dim lights in Toby's life that she failed to see the bright, capable woman she had actually raised. Her phone chimed. It was a message from Zara. "I'm heading home tomorrow, Mama. I need some space, but I want you to know that Toby is still here, and I am still happy." Maryam's fingers trembled as she typed back. She started to write a warning, a reminder to be vigilant, but she stopped. She deleted the words one by one. She realized that trust was not a luxury you gave to others. It was a release you gave to yourself. "Be wise," she typed finally. Then, after a long, painful hesitation, she added the words that felt like the true end of her journey. "And be happy. I am learning to let go the lifeguard." She leaned back and closed her eyes. She had traveled to supervise a date, but she had returned, finally finding the woman she was meant to be. Not a warden, but a mother. For the first time in months, the alarm bells in her chest were silent.
Thanks for watching. God bless you.